Why, when I was a kid, we used to have to march through the snow in massive storms to get to our school, where they would tape our mouths shut and they'd put blinders on us and they would force us to read these books. Well, not really. It was actually a much more pleasant experience than that. I developed a lifelong love of reading, actually. They did provide some fantastic books when I was in school, and I was always interested in the choices that they made. At the end of this video, I'm going to ask you a pretty obvious question, but I have a follow-up to that pretty obvious question that'll make a lot more sense if you watch the whole video. So once you've seen the video, I hope that you'll hit the comment section below and answer the question that I'm going to ask you at the end. So for myself, I went to school in about the mid-70s to the mid-80s. That was my grade school era. And a lot of the books on this list, I think, are reflective of that era. And there's a reason why I think they're reflective of the era. They're all pretty much classics, because that's what we learn in school. We read a lot of books that have been proven, a lot of books that have a good amount of history behind them. So the first book that I remember, and this must have been grade 3 or 4 that I read this book, was a book called Rabbit Hill. I don't have a copy of Rabbit Hill. I don't have a copy of many of these books, but Rabbit Hill still resonates with me, and it's a book that I think one day maybe I'll read for fun. And Rabbit Hill resonates with me because it was a book that helped me really empathize, especially empathize with animals. The book is, of course, anthropomorphic, so it's about rabbits that live on Rabbit Hill and do rabbit things. And you might say, did you just describe Watership Down? Yeah, I did describe Watership Down, but this would be an easier to read version of Watership Down. I've never read Watership Down, so maybe I shouldn't speak to that, but I do remember Rabbit Hill and a few subsequent books in the series being quite easy to read and really being something that, as a child in grade 3 or 4, made me think about what it meant to be kind to animals, and maybe animals had feelings and maybe they cared about the world around them. So that anthropomorphics is something that I've always really enjoyed in my reading. Even when I was a kid, and admittedly as an adult, when I read comics, I do like anthropomorphic comics, comic books like Uncle Scrooge or Mickey Mouse, and some of these comics that are maybe taking an animal and putting human attributes to those animals. So Rabbit Hill, first book I remember reading in school, and I remember that with fond memories. The next book is a book that I think will surprise many of you, because I think a lot of you may not have heard of it. And if you have heard of it, then there's 2 things I know about you. 1, you're probably Canadian, and 2, you're awesome, because it's The Secret World of Og. And this is a book that I do have a copy of after all these years. The Secret World of Og. And this is actually the edition and the cover that I had in school. I remember this book. I love this book, and there's some reasons why I love this book. So briefly, this book is it's written by a very famous Canadian writer, Pierre Berton, and it's illustrated by his daughter, which I think is really cool. I love books that are a bit of a family affair here, and Pierre Berton is an extraordinarily famous Canadian writer. I'm not sure how well known outside of Canada he is, but a very famous writer. So this is a great book that he wrote for his children. And the book is, and obviously his children participated in the book later, his one daughter there. And what I love about this book is that it is a standard children's book with a group of children disconnected from the adults. They don't have to deal with the adults, and they're in their playhouse, and there's no real spoilers here. They're in their playhouse, and they discover a subterranean world. Now, this book would have been somewhere, well, I would have read it somewhere in the mid-70s, but subterranean worlds, this lit me on fire for any book with subterranean worlds. A classic example of that is Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, one of my favorite books by Jules Verne. And it's very interesting that the subterranean theme comes out in The Secret World of Og, and it's used as a way of having an other world. A world that's different from our own, but still has a connection to our own world, a world beneath our feet, layers of humanity, layers of civilization beneath our feet. Now, it's a book for children, The Secret World of Og, so it doesn't go into a lot of depth there, but subterranean worlds is a very foundational aspect to science fiction. If you look at the science fiction, you have, of course, Frankenstein as considered potentially the first science fiction novel of all time. But following or contemporary to Frankenstein, we have a lot of science fiction books that almost are adventure, a combination of adventure and natural science, so the world around us. And the concept of subterranean worlds is a big thematic element in the earliest of science fiction, which is a genre that I'm very fond of. So I could almost say that potentially my interest and my entry into the world of science fiction and reading more science fiction, like the Verne books, The Journey to the Center of the Earth, and the movie by Disney, of course, helped me get cemented into that as well. And in fact, there's an Uncle Scrooge story, a comic book, The Land Beneath the Ground. So the theme of subterranean worlds was very foundational to the beginning of science fiction. In fact, if you know of any great books that are more modern that deal with subterranean themes, I'd be really interested in learning about them. But they made us read The Secret World of Og, and a brief thing in there is that the citizens of the world of Og they only use the word Og to communicate. So they use inflection and such to, Og, 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 Og. And we had a lot of fun with that when we were kids. The next set of books that I remember reading in school tended to get a little bit more serious and a lot quicker. So I sort of remember, that was sort of my grade 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember those two books. There were many more books in there as well, I'm sure, but those are two that stood out. The next books that I remember reading were now in the grade 8, 9 sort of range. And during that time, we were pretty much in the middle of a Cold War. So that's where we had a lot of tension in the world. And that was reflective, I think, in the decisions that were made in the books that we read. They were books about authoritarianism. They were books about maybe more dystopian type futures. So one of them would be Lord of the Flies. I don't have a copy hanging around of Lord of the Flies. That's one of those books that appears and disappears out of my library quite a bit. So Lord of the Flies was an interesting book that I remember reading that. I wouldn't say it was my absolute favorite book that I read in my school years, but it stuck with me in the concepts of, again, children disassociated from the adult world. That's a big theme in children's literature. So we have the orphan children, we have children that are separated from their parents. That's a very common theme, and that becomes something that Lord of the Flies really exemplifies. Of course, the children are nasty, nasty children. But anyway, so the Lord of the Flies, I remember reading that in school. I'm sure that's one that some of you have also read in school, and you can, again, comment down below, but wait for my question at the end of the video, because then you can answer that at the same time. The other book that we read, this was a weird book. Actually, this goes back to maybe grade 6, grade 7. It was The Hobbit, right? Tolkien's The Hobbit. I do have a copy of that book, but I forgot to bring it here. But so who doesn't have a copy of The Hobbit? Raise your hands. So most people have a copy of The Hobbit if you're an avid reader, as long as you like the genre. So The Hobbit's an interesting book because it wasn't a book that we read. It was a book that was read to us. And I thought that was an odd choice for the school to do that, but that's how it was. I became much more interested in the universe of Tolkien afterwards. I didn't really enjoy having the book read to me, to be blunt, but I do remember that as a distinct, why are they reading The Hobbit to us? I would rather read that myself. Anyways, that's a little aside. The next book, of course, very famous book. This comes in many, many editions, and that's 1984. And 1984 was very much resonated with the times. So this is, I'm not going to go into a literary review of the book 1984. That has been done to death. To be honest, I'm a reader. I'm not a literary critic. I don't have a degree in English. I don't have a degree in political science. But 1984 is a book that I have read multiple times. And interestingly, it's a book that my son has chosen to read as well. So I had to run upstairs and snatch that copy off off his bookshelf. But very interesting book. And that was interesting that they had us read that, because I read it before 1984. So I read it, obviously we didn't think, in the few years in the interim that we were going to turn into that world. But it is an interesting thing to have read the book 1984 before the year 1984. And it was, about control. And, definitely sort of our generation that was a fear that we had, that we would have some sort of autocratic control over our lives, that could happen. So very impactful book. We had a lot of great discussions of that. And for someone that's in grade 8 or 9, having those larger context discussions, it's part of growing up. It's part of making sense making of the world. So I think that was a good choice. I think that was a good choice for them to do that. And then also the other book that we read was Animal Farm. That's another book by Orwell, and that was also a very impactful book. I don't have a copy of that hanging around, but that was an interesting book because that was, again, another book about control, about structures, about the idea of, one group controlling another group. That was a big theme when I was going to school. There was a lot of, a lot of our teachers, and so this is, again, going back to my experience in school, I had older teachers who literally not just survived in World War II as children, but some of them actually probably fought in World War II, because they would have been in their 50s or 60s in the 70s, so they would have been born in the 1920s, so they may have very well served in World War II, and or some of the younger teachers at that point may have been alive during World War II. Some of them may have come from Europe, and then also we had some teachers, the young teachers, that would have graduated in the 60s from their education, from the university and from college. So they would have had that 60s mentality. So books like 1984 and Animal Farm were really all about, be careful of the governments, be careful of others that are trying to control you. And that, that still resonates, so this is not a political channel, but those are pretty political books and they give you ideas, right? So the next book is also more of a science fiction book, but again, horribly dystopian. There wasn't a lot of levity in the books that we read, and that would have been Brave New World. So Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And this book here, it's funny, I read it way back then and it was an okay book. And I started reading it again fairly recently. And this is one of those books where, I'm not afraid, if I'm not feeling the vibe of a book, I'll just put it down and say, you know what, maybe I need to visit that book later. I'll do a video on that as well, when to say no to a book, when to let go of a book, either through disappointment or the timing isn't right, or it's something that's just not working for you. So I recently went to reread this book and it just wasn't working for me, so I decided not to. Back in the school days, you have chapters due, you're going to have a discussion, you have to talk about it. So those are just a few of the books that I would have read in school. The other thing, and we were very fortunate in that the school provided these great anthologies, and in addition to reading novels, I do remember during the school years, we used to read a lot of short stories. So we had collections of books that contained short stories, and several of those short stories still resonate with me as well. There's one by Alice Munro that I still think of to this day. There's, of course, The Metamorphosis. I still think of that story to this day. And I have to look this one up. I should have looked it up before I filmed the video. But something Bergeron. No, I have to look up the book. Somebody can comment down below. Maybe I'll put it up here as a tile, the title of the short story. And I always remember that, the idea of the handicapper general that goes in and creates equality by putting artificial handicaps on people, which is a very contentious issue. And we had a lot of different conversations about that. Again, well selected to elicit a lot of conversation. And you can go a lot of different ways with that. So anyways, I hope you found this interesting. Here's the question that I have for you. What books did you read in school? You probably expected me to ask that. But here's what I'd really like to know. What era did you go to school, and were the books that you read in school reflective of the era that you were in school, what was happening in society as a whole. And it doesn't mean that the book needed to be written during that era. All of the books that I quoted, except maybe for The Secret World of Og, were all written well before I ever went to school. But they were still, the themes of those books were very important in society at the time during the Cold War, during the mid-70s to the mid-80s. So I'd be really interested in hearing what books you read in school and whether the themes of those books were something that was part of your society at the time or was part of what was happening on a more global scale. Maybe getting a little bit deep here, but that's the idea. I'm very interested in those thoughts. So thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to check out some other videos on the channel or even subscribe, you can do that. Hopefully I'll start producing videos maybe once a week, or I can only read so fast. So if I'm doing book reviews, I won't be able to be doing those on a fast basis, but we'll see. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.